Well, hello everybody. Well, welcome to the first Barts 900 webinar of 2021. Welcome particularly to all those new listeners who are joining us for the first time tonight. We've been running these webinars for some 6 or 7 months, as many regulars will know, but we're beginning to lay out our program through the coming months, particularly in view of the extended lockdown that was announced a little earlier, to try and bring you some aspects of Bart's heritage to entertain and inform you in these difficult times. My name is Robert Trahan-Jones. I'm the chairman of the Friends of Bart's Heritage. And just to repeat some the news that I often bring you, these webinars are entirely free of charge, but we are immensely welcome to those of you who do donate money to support us in our efforts, and you can use the donate button on our website at bartsheritage.org.uk. We are immensely grateful for all you're able to give to support these efforts. Now, in a minute, I'll be introducing my speaker, but first of all, I need to describe the usual format that we have for these evenings. So our speaker and I will chat during the presentation that will last some 40 minutes, and we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions, and we hope to wrap up in about 3/4 of an hour in all. During the presentation, if you want to make use of the chat or the Q&A buttons at the bottom of the screen to ask questions or make comment, then by all means do so. And either Will Palin or myself will pick up those aspects during the show and either answer them with our speaker or address them right at the end. Now, as you'll see behind me, I appear to be speaking to you from directly above the Hogarth stair in the Great Hall at Barts, and that's entirely appropriate because our speaker tonight will address the whole issue of Bart's most famous artist, William Hogarth. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Jacqueline Riding. Hello, Jackie.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Now, I suppose we ought to begin in time-honoured fashion, as we do with all our guests. Jackie, tell us a little bit about yourself and your extensive career in a short space of time, perhaps, and what led you to this particular interest in Hogarth?
Well, I started working on 18th century British art and architecture almost 30 years ago when I started my MA at Birkbeck with Will Vaughan. Anybody who's done art history will have heard of Will Vaughan. And then I started a PhD at Birkbeck on the contemporary of William Hogarth, Joseph Highmore. I actually stopped the PhD because I became director of the Handel House Museum, and it was more than enough having to set up a museum and run it, let alone doing a part-time PhD. So I reactivated the PhD in 2007 on Joseph Highmore when I was freelancing. I'd left Handel House. I had spent a year or 2 years on the Claw Leadership Programme, which is a cultural leadership programme. I was in the first year of that, and had gone freelance, so I had a bit more flexibility. So I decided to reactivate the PhD with Mark Hallett at York, and I concluded the PhD and successfully got it in 2012 while I was working on Mr. Turner, Mike Lee's Mr. Turner. So I was doing the PhD as well as working on that film. And from publishing point of view, just after I finished the PhD and working on Mr. Turner, I wrote a book on the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion for Bloomsbury, which was published in 2016. And then soon after that, I started working with Mike Lee again on Peterloo, the Peterloo Massacre, and I wrote a tie-in book on that, which came out just in time for the film in October 2018. And then my next book is the book that I'm just about to publish, still scribing away, sort of making little corrections as I speak. But that's due to come out on the 29th of April this year, 2021. And that's with Profile Books, who happen to have moved within the last year or so to Cloth Fair, which obviously is just north of Barts Hospital.
Okay. William Hogarth, as I described, Bart's most famous artist, but very much a man of many parts. So I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say we're very much looking forward to your presentation. Please, away you go.
So my first image I'm showing you here is not me. It's actually the great man himself, William Hogarth, self-portrait from circa 1730 to 35. So he's in his mid-30s at the point that he painted this lovely self-portrait, which is at the Yale Centre for British Art. And I'm using this image as a way of introducing him to you, if you don't know Hogarth intimately. And it's a lovely image. And in fact, I open the book, almost the first thing I do in the book, in the prologue of the book, is to describe this painting as an introduction to the reader, to the artist William Hogarth. Hogarth was known as Billy to his friends and also his wife, Jane or Jenny, Jane Thornhill, daughter of Sir James Thornhill, who we'll get onto in a minute. And I don't know about you, Robert, but I love this portrait in particular because I think it's much looser, much a freer image than the one you're used to seeing of Hogarth, slightly more stern Hogarth, because he's in his mid-30s. He's on the cusp of fame, really, in this period, which we'll go on to in a minute. But I love the sort of the loose handling of it. I think it's got a real edge of optimism about it, but also a sort of kindness and softness that we might not expect from the artist who created Gin Lane, the 4 Stages of Cruelty, Industry and Idleness, and so on. So I think it's the softer side of Hogarth, as well as the gritty satirist, the street, the wanderer of the streets of London, and the chronicler of the warty underbelly, as we call it, of the Georgian age. That there's a softer side and even a spiritual, one might even describe a religious side to Hogarth. And I think this painting sort of at least gives you the youthful, still youthful artist, full of optimism for the future and so on. So I particularly love this self-portrait. So Hogarth was born in 1697 in Bartholomew Close, which of course is this very strange sequence of courts and alleyways that if you see the arrow where you've got Middlesex Court at the top, Bartholomew Close, the arrow is actually pointing to Middlesex Court, and Hogarth's house, which was a survivor of the fire of 1666, where he was born, was actually at the entrance, the very tip of the arrow there, which is in Bartholomew Close. That's precisely where he was born, on the 10th of November 1697, and he died in 1764, just to sort of conclude his dates. And I'm showing you this brilliant map by John Roke, which was published in 1746, that gives you all the street names, the courts, etc., of the whole of London. But we're just zooming in on the area around West Smithfield, as it's properly called. Anyone who works at Barts or knows the area knows it's West Smithfield, which is where, if you look at the little wedge shape in almost centre just to the north, below Middlesex Court, you can see the main wedge, the white wedge of West Smithfield. And then to the sort of top left of it is actually where the sheep pens were. So you can actually see the sheep pens on this map. So this is the sort of area that Hogarth was born in and was very much a formative place for him as a child and also as a young man. So that's where he was precisely born. Very next door to his house was St Bartholomew the Great, which is what's left of the Priory Church of St Bartholomew. And that's where his birth was registered and where he was baptized. So the very font that Billy Hogarth was baptized in is still in the church. And it's certainly, if you're going to go on a kind of Hogarth pilgrimage around London, then St Bartholomew the Great, along with Barts itself and so on, is certainly a place that should be visited. Just south of the little note that says St Bartholomew the Great is St Sepulchre Church, and you can't talk about St Sepulchre without talking about Newgate Prison, which is just to the east of St Sepulchre. Newgate Prison is where the condemned were held prior to the parade, the 2 to 3 hour parade west to Tyburn, which is the modern day Marble Arch, along Holborn and then along Oxford Road, as it was then, Oxford Street, to as I say, the modern day Marble Arch. St Sepulchre Church, actually the bell would ring the entire estimated length of the journey, 2 to 3 hours, and that was every month. So Hogarth in his youth would have heard this bell tolling the condemned to their final journey. And obviously the most famous image associated with that journey to Tyburn is the penultimate image in the Industry and Idleness, where Tom Idle, his final journey is to be hanged at Tyburn. So again, this is all part of the DNA, Hogarth's DNA, associated with the area where he was born. Fleet Debtors Prison is just to the south of there, just to add to the terror and horror of this area. But his father, Richard, ended up in the prison because he had to claim himself as a bankrupt, because his various speculative projects failed, and so he ended up in the Fleet prison. So another horrible aspect of Hogarth's childhood. When he was about 10 or 11, he would have been living within the rules of the Fleet prison. So that's another aspect of the area and his youth. And then just south of there, Bridewell House of Correction, which appears, and we'll see it later, in Harlot's Progress. So, and then to the right, perhaps the most significant building built after the fire of London is, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral. And the most important aspect of that, apart from the fact it was a prominent landmark in the immediate area, was that the dome, the interior of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral was painted by Sir James Thornhill, who, as I say, was Hogarth's father-in-law, but he was the most famous and most successful English artist of the late 17th, early 18th century. So very much a figure that artists like Hogarth and his contemporaries very much admired and honoured the success of a knighted English artist. In conjunction with St. Paul's, Hogarth talks about when he's apprenticed to a silversmith when he's young, very much against his inclinations. He wanted to be a fine artist. He talks about St. Paul's Cathedral, the paintings by Thornhill at St. Paul's, and also the paintings by Thornhill at Greenwich Hospital, Naval Hospital, as being the sort of the images that drove him on, the images that swirled around his head, that made him want to be an artist, and not just an artist, but a great artist that makes their mark on the city, on the public, on posterity, but the city of London. So in many ways, Thornhill is Hogarth's guiding star, his exemplar, and by luck or design, his father-in-law. So that's just a little survey of the area. I don't know if you have any observations, Robert, about the vicinity.
I'd like, if I may, to come back to his birth in Middlesex Court, because you will be far more familiar with how that area looked in that period. But my guess is that it would be difficult to be born anywhere near a Barts unless you were actually within the hospital itself. And I think that many members of the Barts and former Barts community who are watching tonight will be familiar with the modern day equivalent of Middlesex Court, which is Middlesex Passage. And many will know as the alleyway that was accessible just outside the old QE2 building and provided a short cut through to, well, I suppose the Hand and Shears was the nearest landmark through there. But it was his geographical proximity that to Barts that dictated much of what you'll be talking about later in the presentation.
I think it was certainly one major stimulus, for him to be involved with Barts, was the fact he was a local boy. But as you say, we'll get on to that later. But in the map, interestingly, in 1746, you can see that when John Roke had sort of completed the design for the map, only 2 of the wings had actually been built, the north and south wing, according to this map. So the arrow for Barts points straight into the courtyard, the central courtyard of Barts, if you're trying to get your orientation. So I've focused my slides very much inevitably on medical issues associated with Hogarth's images, his pictures, medical and hospitals as well. So my next image, I don't know if anyone is particularly well known, but this is a wonderful sketch of showing you the interior of a ward and we believe a woman having her leg, possibly ulcerated leg, being attended to by a physician. And as the little note at the bottom left suggests, it's been thought that this is a rejected design by Hogarth for Harlot's Progress, which is very much it's the first of his modern moral series And it's the series that really establishes him as an artist, and establishing his income. And also the manner in which he generates his income. Hogarth, this is the first series where he paints 6 canvases for the Harlot's Progress, and then he engraves after the painting. So he doesn't make his money from the paintings, they're just there for promotion, for people to see what the story is he's trying to tell. He makes his money through the engravings. And Harlot's Progress, and his 2 scenes from the Harlot's Progress, had thousands of subscribers. So it really was a major hit. And top left, I'm showing you, well, actually, it's the interior of the Bridewell. So that's the association with Hogarth's childhood, the vicinity of his childhood home at top left. So this is where Moll, or Mary Hackabout, the prostitute, has been arrested and convicted for prostitution, and she's now beating hemp as a sort of hard labour as a result of her conviction. So that's happening just to the south of where Hogarth was born. And then bottom right, you've got the penultimate scene, the 5th scene out of 6 of Harlot's Progress. And this is where Moll is actually dying from venereal disease, and 2 medics, they're probably quack doctors, who have pills, in inverted commas, that can save her from her venereal disease, which of course, you know, was incurable. And they're arguing over their quack remedies while she expires next to the fire. So again, a medical connection there. Even as Hogarth was creating Harlot's Progress, he was almost certainly conceiving a parallel progress based on the idea of Pilgrim's Progress for a male protagonist, and that was Tom Rakewell. So I'm showing you scene 7 and scene 8. So the last 2 scenes of an 8 series, so much more ambitious than Harlot's Progress. But top left is Tom Rakewell is now in the debtor's prison. He's now in the Fleet. So even though this may not be an exact image of an interior, a room at the Fleet, you can get a sense of the sheer feel of it, the sense of it, the sense of despair, the very sort of humble, slightly dilapidated interior with barely any property. So you can imagine poor Richard Hogarth occupying a room like this when Hogarth was 10 or 11 years old. So there's an element of personal experience here. And the fact that the father, who I think worked very hard, and even though we talked about it before, didn't we, Robert, about his idea of a coffee house, which was in the vicinity just near St. John's Gate, where you could speak Latin. It was encouraged that you could speak Latin at this coffee house. It's one of Richard Hogarth's ideas to make money. Richard Hogarth was in many ways a gentleman in the sense he was a scholar. He was extremely proficient in both Latin and ancient Greek, so he had a very good gentlemanly education. And of course, being able to speak, read and write Latin was crucial to the law in this period, amongst other professions. But it was very much an indication of a gentleman's education. So the idea that you could go to a coffee house and over a cup of coffee or something stronger, practice your Latin isn't quite as bonkers as perhaps we might think now. But nonetheless, it failed, and poor Richard did end up in the Fleet prison. So there's his son returning to that painful memory through the penultimate scene in the Rake's Progress. And then bottom right is obviously the famous Bedlam scene, Bethlehem Hospital, the asylum, and again, it's connected to the idea of hospitals and medicine. So these are the series that Hogarth is doing prior to his involvement with Bart. So this is the idea of the progress, the procession through a narrative, through a story. It involves medicine and physic. It involves mental health and so on. So he's already involved in that. He's already depicting it. Even so, and we all think of Hogarth as being Rake's Progress, Harlot's Progress, and so on. He actually did make his name initially in the late 1720s, early 1730s as a portrait painter of what was called conversations. These are full-length group portraits in little. So imagine somebody who's known for doing small-scale painting, whether it's the canvases for Rake, Harlot, all these little portraits. He then moves on to, and he's very proud of this, he writes about it later on in life. He says, I went from painting portraits in little to figures, 7-foot tall figures, groups, grouped in a narrative painting. And this, of course, is the Pool of Bethesda, which was the first canvas he unveiled at Barts in 1736. So it's, and I think it's his arrogance and his chutzpah, I think, is completely justified. If you can imagine going from small scale to a painting. I've got the size of these paintings. So the Pool of Bethesda is 4 meters high, and then over 4 meters high, and then over 6 meters wide. So this is a very ambitious, extremely ambitious. Nobody was painting on this scale after Sir James Thornhill. I mean, this is a monumental scale, and Hogarth is very much attempting to imitate the genre, history painting, narrative painting, and interior, completely covering a wall with painted figures, scenes, and so on, very much in imitation of Sir James Thornhill. Unfortunately for Hogarth, as he's embarking on this, he becomes a governor of the hospital in 1734. Unfortunately, his father-in-law dies. So the very person who would have been the natural mentor to get him through this project, sadly was no longer around. So Hogarth was very much, to an extent, on his own. So as Robert mentioned before, Hogarth is a local boy. So he would have been desperate for one of the rare occasions where you can do a project like this. He would have been desperate for that he should get it, even though he was not known for doing anything of this type or on this scale. He would have been extremely keen to have the opportunity to do it. I think to an extent because of the sort of rather tragic history of his father, the failure of his father, and the fact that the whole family had to live within the rules of the fleet. There's an element of trying to sort of exorcise the past, that this is a local boy made good, and he is now highly successful and able to do this project. But most immediately was the fact that there was rumours afoot that the commission for this staircase, these monumental canvas, had already been handed to an Italian artist, Giacomo Amigoni. And that was just too much for Hogarth, because these commissions were as rare as hen's teeth in this country. Nobody was vying, or certainly British artists weren't vying with Italians in their own country. And of course, Italian artists had not only secular rulers, dukes, princes, and so on. They also had the Catholic Church, which invested huge amounts of money in the decoration of their, the building and decoration of their churches with precisely this type of grand scale images and painted images. So Hogarth was absolutely determined to get the commission. And so he rather cannily offered his services free of charge, and no charity should be seen to be refusing free help for anything. And so without any experience whatsoever in doing something on this scale, just sheer chutzpah, confidence, and the fact he was offering it free of charge, as had indeed James Gibbs had also done and become a governor as a result. Hogarth offers his services free of charge, and then he becomes a governor, and then he sets about painting these canvases. I don't know if you want to interject.
Yeah, actually, Jackie, I wonder if the chronology in that is correct, because my understanding is that Gibbs was appointed a governor, and then his fellow governors had been quite canny about that because they realized that he was an architect of merit. So on the back of this appointment, they got him to agree to design the new hospital free of charge. Whereas you say that with Hogarth, he was appointed a governor on merit, having painted the murals beforehand.
Oh, no, he hadn't painted the murals he became a governor in July 1734. He didn't start painting them until 36, 37.
Right, so maybe it was the governors being canny about this as well in that
I'm
case.
sure the governors were extremely canny. I mean, there's a little confusion over the timing of whether Hogarth offers to do them free of charge and then becomes a governor, or becomes a governor and then offers to do it free of charge. But either way, he sees he's definitely following in James Gibbs's footsteps by offering his services free of charge, whichever way round it goes. But I think that was just his way of getting the foot in the door. And that they would take a punt on somebody who simply didn't have the experience to do this kind of thing. But as ever with these things, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't have the experience, therefore you never get the commissions, therefore you don't get the experience, and Hogarth's just saying, just give me a chance, let me do it. And he produced these magnificent paintings. So the Pool of Bethesda, which was the first one to go up, I'm not completely clear myself about how these paintings were executed and at what moment they were brought to the hospital. I mean, we know that Hogarth, his very close friend, George Lambert, was the in-house scene painter and designer for the Covent Garden, the Theatre Royal Covent Garden, which had just opened in 1732 in the current site on Bow Street. And he would have had access to a painting loft that was big enough to accommodate these sorts of canvases. And it has to be said, there is something inherently theatrical about the way Hogarth has executed these, has designed and composed this scene of Christ by the Pool of Bethesda, which is a pool that's thought to have had curing properties. And therefore he's surrounded by people with various medical complaints who are gathered together to find some respite from their afflictions. He's at that wonderful colonnade at the back that sweeps around the back as if it's a piece of opera. I mean, it's like opera scenery, the angel floating off on high. The very fact that the entire scene has been encased and all the figures are beautifully planted on a stage. I think the perspective is, I think, really well done, considering you are approaching it at different angles when you actually see the physical, the painting in its context. And I think he's done a fantastic and beautiful job. It's not everybody does, but I personally think that this is really monumental. And of course, the thing that Hogarth does, which is unique probably, is that he combines the sheer scale and grandeur of Baroque interiors by people like Thornhill, Laguerre, Charon, Amagoni, and so on, and then introduces people into this, and then perhaps epitomised by this wonderful figure of Charles I by the great sort of patron saint of British art in the 18th century, Sir Anthony van Dyck, I think is actually a model for the figure of Christ, to give him an elevated sort of regal presence within the canvas. But he's also famously introduced people who have clearly got recognisable complaints, who would be people perhaps attending the hospital or had been involved. And in fact, they are the very beneficiaries of the hospital that this very image is intended to encourage people to donate towards, so that they can continue to care and look after them. So I've just highlighted 3 from this massive group of individuals. I think rather wonderfully, the woman on the left, bottom left, who apparently has something called green sickness, and I don't dare analyse that in such company, particularly with the apparently anemia, wasting disease, but rather brilliantly, he's put her in a greenish dress, maybe to hint at the affliction that she has. The central woman is certainly a rich woman, probably modelled, or has, from one of Hogarth's biographers, describes it as being, the model was a courtesan. Nonetheless, she's thought to have some form of syphilitic arthritis, so she's got ulcers on her legs and so on. That's how this interesting connection to that previous, the little sketch that could be for Harlot's Progress. The woman seems to be having an ulcer being attended to on her leg, so it's possibly there's a connection there between that sketch and then this figure within the Pool of Bethesda. And then on the right-hand side, the woman at the back, rather beautifully, Christ's hand is actually extended out, and he's indicating towards the man about to rise up, the lame man who's about to rise. But at the same time, he's actually indicating towards a woman with her child who has scrofula, which is apparently a form, is it the same it's like TB, but it manifests itself around the lymph nodes around the neck. Is that right? It was known as the King's Evil. You think I'm
Yes,
right?
I think it's one of those historic problems. It's not exactly the scourge of general practice in the 21st century, Jackie.
Thank goodness, thank goodness. So I think that, I don't know what you think about it, Robert, because people get quite disturbed by particularly this image, because it does combine the regal figure of Christ in the middle, extending his hand with his hand on his hip in a Van Dykean fashion. This grand interior, this sort of architectural features, and then slightly disturbing images of people with genuine afflictions. But that's the whole point. He's presenting to the people who are visiting this area, which will be donors, potential donors, and so on. He's presenting them with the very people that they are helping, or hopefully will be donating towards if they give some money or time or both to the hospital. The very nature of it now.
Yes, I think it's been 50 years since I first saw the Hogarth paintings, that I first came up the Hogarth stairs. And it's one of those paintings where there is always more to see. And I've heard various interpretations of it, and I've read various definitions of the pathologies that are visible in every one of the patients in the scene. And the more you look, the more you find. And it really is absolutely fascinating. And I suspect that of those many people who are tuning in tonight, okay, the vast majority will have seen these murals in the flesh, but how many will have spotted the fact that so many pathologies are reflected in the individuals depicted? And hopefully, once the restoration is done, this is something that we will be able to bring out in more detail to the wider audience.
Yeah. So the second image, and I should say that they are oil on canvas. So these are large pieces of canvas, which, going back to the idea of them being painted, perhaps started off at the very least, the composition laid on them at Covent Garden, potentially, with the assistance of George Lambert, who's obviously ideal companion to help with this scale of painting and this type of painting. And then perhaps brought in a almost finished state to then be sort of fixed up on battens, because they are not wall paintings as such. They are paintings fixed to battens, fixed to the wall. So they're not murals as such. They're not fresco. They are oil on canvas, and they're fixed to battens. So as far as we know, it's there's reports in the newspapers where they talk about that Hogarth, his canvases had been hung the week before they were formally unveiled. So that does suggest that they were transported from Covent Garden to here, fixed up on their battens, and then perhaps a little bit like Varnishing Day at the Royal Academy, where people, there was definitely scaffolds, and so he would be able to finish them off, touch them in, put in those little extra bits, extra finessing on the finished canvas in situ. And then the scaffolding comes down, and then they're unveiled. But this is in many ways, a simpler image, because this is the Good Samaritan. This is a parable told by Jesus in response to somebody asking, "Who is my neighbor?" And in it, you have a man who's been injured. Two people who are his compatriots have already walked past and just left him. He's been attacked by robbers. He's been beaten. He's got no clothes. He's got no money or anything. Two people have already wandered by, and you can see them. One figure in the back of the painting. So the painting actually has several moments in the parable concertinaed together and presented in a single canvas. There's a figure who's a little less easy to see, but he's just below the figure in the background. And then the person who actually does rescue, who shows fellow feeling and kindness, who shows both practical help, but also, as I say, this idea of fellow feeling, is a Samaritan who traditionally, they were enemies of the Jewish people. So an enemy of the Jewish people has actually shown kindness. So he's ignored any history between them as nations, or as individual nations, and he's approached this person in need as a human being. So it's the true reflection of the idea of charity, which is the love of mankind, which is the Samaritan is showing this by helping this person in need. So combined, the two combined, if you were a visitor in the 18th century, you would have walked into the courtyard, and then there's a door on the courtyard which you would then walk through. I know this because Will Palin told me when I did my socially distanced visit during a slight lifting of the lockdown. You would have walked through this door on the courtyard. Anybody who knows the hospital knows that these lovely doors on the main courtyard. So not where you go through the museum and then you arrive at the staircase that way. You're actually walking through the courtyard and then through that door. And having done it myself, the door opens up, and then the first thing you see when you lift your eyes up, because these are quite high up, because they're on the stairwell, you can see it behind Robert's head in his background. The first thing you see are the two figures. That's all you can see is the two figures, the Good Samaritan and the victim of robbery. And they are looming like gods above your head, these 7-foot images. And that's the first thing you see is practical charity, love of mankind. So you can imagine being incredibly impressed seeing these two looming figures above you. You then walk to your right, so you walk past the Good Samaritan without really being able to see the full expanse of it. And as you're walking forward, you then see Christ right in front of you. So it's his parable, it's his story that he tells. And Christ says, when the man, he tells the story and he goes back to the questioner and he says, so who is the neighbor? Who is your neighbor? And the man says, well, the man indeed was my neighbor, is my neighbor. And Christ says, go and do the same. And that's his final line. That's the whole point of the story, is to do what the Samaritan did. Love your neighbor. So right in front of you, you've got the man who tells the story doing exactly that. He's going and doing the same. And he's your example. So both the Samaritan and Christ are your examples. But you haven't still quite seen the two canvases in their full expanse. So you then hang a right, you continue up the stairs, you walk under Christ's sandal feet, and you get to the half landing, and then you turn back on yourself. You can see the way it curls around behind Robert's head. And then you come back on yourself. And as you're going up that final flight, you'll be able to stand on, with your hand resting on the banister, as it were, and you'd finally be able to see the Good Samaritan in all its glory. So the painting on the left, and then you keep going up, you get to the full landing, you turn right again, and then you turn around, and then you're against the banister, against the balustrade, and you finally get the full image of Christ at the pool of Bethesda. And the Hogarth is not just presenting a painting whose subject is relevant to the hospital, he's presenting it in its context. And he wants you to parade through the story exactly, in my opinion, exactly as I've described it, very sort of badly and loosely. He's wanting the painting, the meaning of the paintings, the feelings to unveil themselves as you're going through, as you're walking up the staircase. So when Barts have raised all their money and able to open this wonderful staircase to the public, I really do encourage everybody to go and see it, because I think if you think of it in its context, it is such a wonderful and ambitious sequence of images, which is there to encourage people to feel the same way and do the same things as the Good Samaritan and as the great exemplar for Christianity, Jesus Christ himself. So in that sense, and I'm going back to this, this is the hard man of graphic satire, presenting you with something which is, now more than ever, that idea of your neighbour, fellow feeling, helping each other. It's a wonderfully uplifting, powerful and uplifting thing. And I think that Hogarth, presents those virtues brilliantly in these two canvases. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Robert.
No, I continue to be overwhelmed by them. It's, as I was saying earlier, only a proportion of our visitors tonight will have seen these in the flesh. Obviously, during the restoration, we'll have to close down the north wing, but that won't happen for a year or two. And then what we hope to do, and I don't think I'm letting out any state secrets, is allowing people to visit in a controlled way so that they can see the restoration take place. And then, of course, once it is complete, then we will have some serious plans for allowing people to enjoy these in all their glory.
Yeah, because I mean, Hogarth he's people at the time just couldn't quite understand what they were looking at. Less about the Good Samaritan, more about the Pool of Bethesda, because it is this mix of the grand, the baroque, the dignity, mixed with the sheer the pain, of these individual complaints and so on. So he's doing something totally different, but it's all based on this idea of go and do the same. It's an exaltation by Christ, and it's a very spiritual. It's about the love of mankind, and it's just wonderful. What I pointed out that the woman, by Christ's hand, Jesus's hand, you have this figure of this woman with this child who's ill, and I think that that's Hogarth almost indicating where his next project is going to be and the subject matter he's going to move on to, because the next project, almost immediately after the Good Samaritan was unveiled in 1737, the following year he's almost certainly already involved in the foundling. So I'll very briefly just talk about this idea of progression, whether it be a rake or a harlot or the Good Samaritan or the Pool of Bethesda. And now we have another process, another progress through a narrative, which is about the abandoning of children, the attempted murder of children too, which the figures in the middle, you've got Thomas Coram, who is holding the charter of the hospital. He is the founder of the foundling hospital. To his left, or his right, our left, is a woman who has just been prevented from stabbing her child with a dagger lying in front of her. The little infant is being held by the beadle, who is the officer in charge of security. And then, in the background, you can see a woman laying a child down on the ground. You've got another child in the front left foreground. Then to the right is the symbols of hope, which are the little foundlings themselves who have been rescued. They are now in the refuge of the foundling hospital, in the care of the foundling hospital. They're being educated, brought up. And then you can see the sort of symbols of husbandry, nautical equipment, and so on. So again, this is just a tiny little image. This was produced for the subscription, which is the fundraising document for the foundling hospital. But even in this little miniature image, he is showing you a progress. But this is the progress of Thomas Coram, who, like Christ, is his exaltation has gone and done the same. He's gone to help foundlings. So he is another figure to look up to, and so on. And then these are the two famous paintings of three famous paintings that are at the foundling by Hogarth. But these two were actually donated to the hospital by Hogarth. The March of the Guards to Finchley, the famous painting of the March connected to the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, was actually won in a lottery by the founding. So these are the two that were donated by Hogarth. So you've got Thomas Coram on the left here, very much in the kind of, one model of this is the Van Dyck portrait, the Grand Manner portrait. A great example of that I've just shown you, which is the portrait of King Charles I. And then on the right, you've got Moses brought before Pharaoh's daughter of 1746. So I just wanted to show where Bart sits in the context of Hogarth's other work connected to whether images of medicine and so on, and then through Bart's, and then moving on to his major involvement, like Bart's, with the foundling hospital, obviously becoming a founding governor of it at the same time as he was still at Bart's. And obviously at the founding hospital, the founding museum, you can go to the courtroom there and you can see portraits of all the hospitals. The idea that the foundling has joined a community of hospitals and that they are the sister institutions of the foundling and all connected. So there's this, with the Pharaoh's daughter, you've got 4 history paintings and these portraits of hospitals. So very much, Hogarth's very much involved in that aspect, both the hospitals but also charity too. Just to sort of emphasise that for the purposes of this.
Interesting question from one of our viewers, Jackie. He asks, what impact did his work at Barts have overall on his professional standing?
Sadly, people, I think one of the nicest things anyone said about it, well, his more overt critic, who was George Virtue, basically said it was as good as we could have expected of him. which of course is damning with slight faint praise. I mean, I don't know how much the hospital was able to generate. You know, how many more people gave because they were so struck by these images. You know, of the Good Samaritan and Jesus. I think it must be very difficult to quantify. I mean, other people were very, you know, positive about them and thought they were great. There was a friend of he was the founding Benjamin Franklin, who was working in the vicinity as a printer. He actually worked in Bartholomew Close. He had a friend called James Ralph, who became a close friend of Hogarth. And he was very much a cheerleader for Hogarth. And he writes how wonderful these paintings are and how magnificent they are. And particularly highlighting Hogarth's generosity and charity, which of course he then continues at the founding hospital with these donations of paintings along with his fellow artists. So this idea of symbiotic relationship between charity, hospital, refuges, and also art, contemporary art as well. Very much a sort of theme of Hogarth's interaction with hospitals.
Well, Jackie, that was a whistle-stop tour through one tiny portion of Hogarth's life and his particular work and his relationship to Bart. So thank you so much for that. I'll give you a chance to talk about your book in just a moment, if I may. I know that prior to this broadcast, you and I had a chat about Hogarth and the various aspects of his life. Will Palin joined in the conversation because he's able to speak with some authority on certain aspects of his work. And we've formed the idea, haven't we, that we might have a little mini series at some stage in the future, looking in depth at further aspects of the man and his work. So thank you so much for volunteering to be an important part of that. I know that Hogarth is a very popular topic, and I'm sure that our viewers will be very keen to follow the progress of that as the months go by. But we'll schedule that at some stage in the future. I was talking just at the top of the program about the program that we at Barts Heritage have laid out for the coming months. I should mention, of course, as many of you know, that we have forged a recent relationship with the City Music Foundation, who are now holding virtual concerts in the Great Hall in a socially distanced manner. And the first of those took place at lunchtime today. And so when we send out our monthly newsletters to you all, you'll be getting news of those City Music Foundation concerts, as well as our own webinars. And next month, I'm pleased to report that we will be welcoming Kate Jarman, who is the Barts Trust archivist, as our guest, and she'll be having a look in depth at some of the artifacts in her collection, talking in detail about their content and their backstory. So I'm sure that will be prove equally popular. If you've enjoyed tonight, do please get in touch using the feedback button, or simply email us using the details that were available in your screen. I'm just checking the Q&A just to see if there's any particular ones that we can answer in the available time left. I don't think so, but I should also mention that, of course, all the recordings of these webinars will be posted up on YouTube, and you'll get the relevant link also in your monthly newsletter. So Jackie, I know you want to talk about your book, the first biography of Hogarth for what, some 20 years or so. This has been your magnum opus for a little while. So when can we look forward, and how can we order a copy?
Well, I was just about to say that if anybody doesn't get their questions answered tonight, I've got my Twitter address up. So if anyone wants to kind of just ping me something, I should be able to answer some questions via that route. I mean, you probably noticed from the way I describe other things is that I kept going back with Hogarth, going back to the idea of progress, or the idea of life itself, but also the way that he progresses through narratives. I mean, it's so obvious, isn't it, when you look at something like Harlot's Progress, where you have 6 scenes laid out and you progress from one to the other. And it just felt like it just seemed to come up all the time, this idea of moving through the city, moving through landscapes, moving through an individual's story. So hence the book is called Life in Progress. So it's as ever with these things, they it is this idea just life is a journey and all that kind of thing in a kind of basic level. But I decided to construct the book slightly unusually by separating the book up into 8 formal chapters, which are more or less chronological and thematic, going from his early life through to his final years, but interspersed through this, sort of weaving through it like the Thames, like the thread of the Thames. Through the 8 chapters are 8 interludes, which are specifically following a journey that Hogarth took with 4 of his friends, setting off in late May 1732 from, of course, from the Bedford Arms Tavern in Covent Garden, where they'd been having a bit of a night, and they decided to just, on spec, go off down the Thames to Gravesend and then walk across the Hoo Peninsula. They went to Rochester, they went to Chatham, and they went up the Medway, wandered up the Medway to the Isle of Grain, and then crossed over to the Isle of Sheppey, and then got a boat back, and they took 5 days doing it. And we're lucky enough to have a manuscript in the wonderful British Museum, Prints and Drawings. It's a handwritten manuscript telling you the journey, various places they stop off at, and various observations that they make, and the people they meet, and so on. And also a sequence of drawings. I think it's about 10 drawings with a map showing you their journey all the way from London to the Isle of Sheppey, with dolphins gambling in the sea, and then all the way back again. So I decided that, again, using this theme of progress, that a way of doing something unusual, but also to spend 5 whole days with Hogarth and his chums in May 1732, that these little interludes would run through, fold through the narrative. So the book is constructed slightly unusually. I hope it works, but it is following in that idea of the progress, which is such a sort of resonant and strong theme in Hogarth's art and life, from the very beginning right the way through to the end.
Thank you very much, Jackie.
You can get the book anywhere where you buy books, but I would obviously want to encourage you to, it'd be lovely if you pre-ordered the book through your local independent bookshop, just to encourage them in these difficult times. That would be great.
Very well said. Yes, thank you. If I could ask you to unshare your screen then finally. Thank you very much. Well, once again, thank you, Jackie, for that whistle-stop tour. Thank you for agreeing to come back again. A number of our speakers have just only been able to touch on their specialist subject in the relatively short time available. So we look forward to welcoming you back later in the series. By the way, I should mention that if any of you have ideas for good speakers or good topics directly related to Barts, its heritage, or indeed the surrounding area, such as the rich history of Smithfield and this part of the city, then do get in touch with your ideas, please. We'd love to hear from you. So that brings us to the end of this evening. Thank you to Will Palin, who's been managing the technology behind the scenes for Jackie and myself during this broadcast. And until we meet again, a very good evening. Bye-bye.